Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a massive shift that's happening right now in the world of highly skilled U.S. immigration. For years, the H-1B visa, it was basically treated as the ultimate, unquestionable default pathway for foreign professionals wanting to enter the American workforce and eventually build a life here. But recently, a whole cascade of fee increases, shifting policies, and just mounting backlogs have forced thousands of workers and their sponsoring employers to completely rethink their long-term strategies. The math is changing, the timelines are stretching, and alternative pathways are suddenly stepping right into the spotlight. It's definitely a lot to take in, so grab your notepad because we're going to break down exactly how this entire equation is being recalculated.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We're going to trace the new math of the H-1B, introduce the EB-5 alternative, put them head-to-head, map out the timeline, and finally, finish with a hard reality check on the risks.
So, is the H-1B still the obvious default? For a really long time, the answer to that was just an undeniable yes. If you were a skilled worker, you got an H-1B, your employer sponsored you, and, well, you waited your turn. But what happens when the cost of waiting just becomes too high for both the employer and the employee? That is the exact question echoing through immigration law offices and financial planning conversations all across the country right now.
Starting off with Section 1, the H-1B math changes, hidden costs and escalating fees.
Now this number is just staggering, $10,000. That's now the baseline cost for a single H-1B petition under the updated fee structures. And honestly, that's before a single hour of attorney fees is even billed. Employers are now looking at a massive stack of expenses: base filing fees, fraud prevention surcharges, mandatory government training fees, and asylum program fees. And if an employer wants premium processing to cut down on wait time uncertainty, which, let's be real, most do, that tacks on several $1,000s more. When you throw in legal fees that typically run between $3,000 and $6,000, the cumulative cost for a visa that still relies on a lottery and offers literally zero guarantee of approval, well, it's becoming incredibly difficult for companies to justify.
But if $10,000 is the nominal cash cost, the time cost is way more severe: 50+ years. No, you heard that right. That is the current estimated backlog for Indian nationals waiting in the EB-2 and EB-3 employment-based green card queues. To put that into perspective, a professional pursuing permanent residency this way is typically going to spend well over a decade, sometimes several, just sitting in H-1B status before a green card even becomes available. So, while the upfront cash cost is high, the cost in time, it's absolutely monumental.
And that extended timeline exposes the applicant to massive structural risk, which brings us to this powerful quote: "A layoff or acquisition does not just cost them a job, it can unwind years of immigration progress." Think about it. Throughout that entire waiting period, the worker is entirely dependent on a single employer. If the company restructures, if there's a layoff, or if an acquisition happens, the worker doesn't just lose their income, they potentially lose their place in line. They can literally unwind years of hard-fought immigration progress practically overnight. These are the hidden costs of the H-1B. They never show up on a single invoice, but they are incredibly real.
Which brings us to Section 2, the EB-5 alternative, a calculated paradigm shift.
Historically, the EB-5 investor visa was kind of dismissed by a lot of professionals as a route reserved exclusively for the ultra-wealthy. But as the H-1B becomes way more expensive and far more uncertain, the EB-5 is quietly being recognized as a highly strategic alternative. Why? Because it offers a defined, employer-independent path to a green card. You are no longer tied to the fate of a corporate sponsor. Instead, you're relying on your own capital investment to carve out your route to permanent residency. Most EB-5 investors aren't just out there building a brand new startup from scratch in their garage. They use regional centers, which are USCIS-designated entities that pool capital from multiple investors. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how these entities completely change the game for job creation. To get an EB-5 visa, your investment has to create 10 jobs. But when you invest through a regional center into a large commercial project, like, say, real estate or infrastructure, you get to use an economic methodology that counts indirect and induced employment, not just direct payroll hires. It makes hitting that 10-job requirement meaningfully easier, especially on massive construction projects.
However, and this is a major caveat from the source material, never navigate the EB-5 marketplace without a licensed EB-5 broker-dealer. Securities regulations apply fully to EB-5 offerings today. The experts strongly advise using a qualified EB-5 broker-dealer, basically a licensed securities intermediary.
Their whole job is to evaluate those complex offering documents, assess the underlying project risk, and spot the red flags that someone outside the industry just wouldn't see. If a project or promoter is operating outside this license framework, that's an immediate warning sign.
Moving right into Section 3, H-1B versus EB-5, the weigh-in.
And this brilliantly illustrates the stark trade-offs when you put them head-to-head. The H-1B costs between $13,000 and $20,000 over time, while the EB-5 requires anywhere from $800,000 to over $1 million. So on paper, sure, the H-1B wins on upfront cost. But dig a little deeper. The H-1B demands an employer, it's subject to a lottery, and it can leave you stuck in a decades-long backlog. That $13,000? It's a sunk cost. It is gone forever. The EB-5, on the other hand, requires no sponsor, has no lottery, and offers a direct path that typically takes 2 to 4 years for many applicants. Plus, that massive upfront cost, it's an investment where capital recovery is actually possible, though, to be clear, it's never guaranteed. It's a total shift in the type of currency you're spending, cash versus time and autonomy.
When you really distill that comparison down, it essentially becomes a choice of which risk you'd rather manage. On the left, the H-1B has lower nominal upfront costs, but it transfers enormous structural risk directly to the applicant. Things like lottery exposure, unpredictable decades-long backlogs, and total employer dependency. On the right, the EB-5 completely eliminates that employer dependency, but it introduces intense financial risk tied directly to the viability of a commercial real estate or infrastructure project.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 4, the EB-5 timeline, visualizing the path to naturalization.
Assuming a smooth process without any significant visa retrogression, here is how that timeline actually unfolds out in the real world. At year 0, you file the I-526C petition, proving your source of funds and the project's business plan. Between years 2 and 4, upon approval, you receive a conditional green card. After 2 years of that conditional residency, so we're looking at years 4 to 6, you file the I-829 petition to prove the jobs were actually created, which then removes the conditions. Finally, by years 6 to 8, standard naturalization rules apply, and you become eligible for full U.S. citizenship. For high backlog nationalities on the employment side, reaching citizenship in 6 to 8 years is practically science fiction, but here it's a structural reality.
Finally, let's look at Section 5. Risks and realities. Time for the reality check.
When you're evaluating projects, you're generally going to see 2 main price tags. A targeted employment area, or TEA, reduces the minimum investment to $800,000, compared to a standard investment of $1,050,000. But the source material is very clear here. Location should never be the sole driver of your decision. The fundamentals of the project are what truly matter. Does it have solid underlying economics, experienced developers? A well-structured standard project at $1 million might actually carry far less overall risk than a poorly structured TEA project at the lower amount.
So the crucial point is understanding the unvarnished realities of the EB-5 before just jumping in. First off, the liquidity constraints are severe. Your capital is typically locked up for 5 to 7 years, maybe even longer if the project stalls. Second, processing times absolutely fluctuate. You have to rely on current data from USCIS, the government agency controlling these timelines, not outdated averages. Third, country of birth still matters. Nationals of China, India, and Vietnam can still face visa retrogression even after their initial petitions get approved, just because of per-country caps. And finally, no matter what a glossy brochure tells you, capital recovery is never ever guaranteed. Your money is genuinely at risk.
Which leaves us with this final, pivotal question. As the H-1B becomes more expensive, more heavily scrutinized, and fraught with literally decades of waiting, the gap between these two pathways has significantly narrowed. Now, for some, the H-1B remains the only viable option, but today they enter it with clearer, perhaps much more sobering expectations. But for those who actually have the capital and a firm commitment to U.S. residency, the EB-5 has clearly shifted from an expensive outlier to a tangible, reliable route. So what do you think? Are the predictable financial costs of the EB-5 a fair price to pay to escape the unpredictable structural risks of the H-1B? It is a complex equation for sure, and one that more professionals are recalculating every single day. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.